terms of just finishing off our recap from the first session, I mentioned the name Pierre Vac to you. He was the gentleman who started off scenario planning at Shell in the 1970s. He led a team that created this scenarios department, and many people at Shell credit them with transforming the fortunes of this company to make them one of the largest oil and gas companies in the world. So the work of Pierre Vac is quite useful to go through and look at when we reflect on what scenario planning is all about. And he says that when you're working in this area, there are three things you have to go through and create that help you focus on future thinking. So number one is that you have to go through and make sure that what you're focused on is relevant to your organization. You remember that a few moments ago I was explaining about the potential for wild, crazy guessing to go through and dilute scenario planning. What you need to do is to go through and try and focus on events and trends, subject areas which are relevant to your organization. So make scenarios relevant. Number two, they have to be challenging. They have to be something which could threaten the existence of your organization. Number three, you have to make them plausible. They have to stand up to scrutiny. You have to link it to macro trend data. And he wants to remind everybody that does scenario planning that the first time you do this exercise, it's quite difficult to get your head around. But if you keep on repeating scenario planning, it makes more sense the more you do it. Okay, it becomes more substantial and more plausible. One of the core things of scenario planning is this thing about unexpected events, these inconceivable things. They're called weak signals. And a lot of this course is getting you to go through and think about how do you get your head around what a weak signal is. So I'm going to be repeating this quite a few times just to make sure you're absolutely clear about what a weak signal is. So a reminder, a weak signal is something which looks like it is random or disconnected at first. But then you go through and build upon a few extra bits of information, and then you realize that this is going to become a significant pattern that could be really challenging to your organization, right? So it starts off like it's a random, disconnected bit of information, but the more you put the pieces together, the more challenging it is. So that's the first way of looking at a weak signal. A second way of looking at it is to go through and say that a weak signal is something which is really hard to grasp at the moment. It's hardly perceptible, but becomes a very strong trend in the future. And that trend will actually have really significant, challenging consequences to your organization. So these are some of the definitions of weak signals. So what are the different categories of weak signals in the business world? I'm going to go through and give you some of the most common examples. So number one is when your value proposition changes. This is a direct threat to your business model. And this is seen frequently throughout the course of human history. Number two, this is when suddenly you're hit by a new, very strong competitor. Number three, this is when you go through and actually have breakthrough technology. So the advent of frontier technologies which fundamentally alter that industry. That's the third example of a category of weak signal. Number four is when you actually have disruptive events. That could be weather-related events, that could be political-related events, but this is where you go through and have an event that you're not expecting. Quite often this happens in the political world. So that's number four as a category of weak signal. Number five, this is called a small trigger where you might have a premonition or an intuition that things are changing. That could be that people, let's say, you get fewer messages about a particular type of product or service. For me, it's when I go into a newsagent in the UK and I realize that I'm the youngest person buying a newspaper. Everybody else is 70, 80 years of age, and I realize that this industry is going to fail very, very quickly in that particular region. So 5 different categories of weak signals. How do you find them? Well, clearly doing scenario planning is intended to help you go through and spot where those weak signals are. And this is through a very thorough analysis of macro trends. There are shortcuts. And when we went through wargaming in the first class, I introduced you to 2 websites which highlight particular weak signals and wildcard events. The third is really by chance. And this is where you might go through number crunching exercises. This is where you might go through and have conversations with your employees, and you spot different patterns emerging. And you realize that something is changing within your industry, which is critical to the survival of your company. And it's the last of these ones that I'm going to go through and focus on for the duration of this class, particularly this phrase called horizon planning. And we'll be talking about that in more detail throughout this second session. We're now going to move on to the next exercise. And this is about identifying weak signals. In the first class, in the last few moments, I've gone through and highlighted what weak signals look like. If you go back to your slides in the first session, go back and think about what exactly is a definition of a weak signal. Now, there are 6 documents that have been uploaded for you to go through and look at. Choose one of urbanization, demography, aging society, Web 9.0, redefining education, or changes in China. The question is, what do you see as weak signals, unexpected events within one of these short documents? And I'll give you about 45 minutes to go through and focus on that.